All right, let's hope that all systems are go here today. I continue to have problems with the audio. I apologize for that if you've been watching any of the videos. But I'm experimenting and I'm learning and all that stuff. It's like, Bob Dylan once said, you need to make 100 bad songs before you can write one good one. I'm actually, so I've made about 1,000 bad economics videos, so one of these days I'll get it right. A loud noise there. That's actually good. I learned this from a friend in the film business, that a good loud sharp noise right at the beginning of a video is good because then you can sync the audio easily. But anyway, okay, so as it happens, right before class, maybe pursuant to making good videos and good lectures and all that stuff, I decided to just kind of delete like 5 slides from this lecture. Because I think the subject is important, and I guess when you have an important message, you don't want to muddy it up with details. So the reason I mention this is because now we'll do this lecture today, but then next class I think we'll have kind of, pick up some loose ends, get some special topics, and then start building macroeconomic theory is kind of the direction we're heading. Now in terms of reading, you'll notice that I actually opened up 2 chapters today, chapter 17 and 17.5. So I think, the way you can kind of think about this is chapter 17 is what we're talking about now. Chapter 17.5 is my little add-on to all of this. I had some slides about it kind of wedged into this lecture, but I decided, you know what? I think it's important enough. This lecture is better off without all of that, those details. And then next lecture we'll be able to talk about some interesting aspects of entrepreneurship in greater detail without trying to rush through it. Right, so anyways. Oh, also, I put up a new problem set, which is on macroeconomic calculations and all that. So there might be one thing that's a little weird to do right now, and it concerns growth rates. We haven't really discussed all the details of calculating growth rates, and there's one little addendum I'd like to make to that. We will do that next time. So we don't muddy up the lecture today. But, as always, we like to start class with a review of what we've been talking about, and we've been talking about these issues of measurement, national income, accounting, and all that stuff. So we talked about how we have this problem where if we want to calculate national income or the total amount of output that is produced in the United States in a given period of time, the same thing basically, we have to add up everything into one unique measure, right? We talked about how you can calculate GDP by just multiplying prices and quantities and adding up. So here I've crushed the world down to make it even simpler. We just have 2 goods, food and clothes. We have their prices, and out of these prices we can calculate a nominal GDP, which is just quantities times prices added up for each year. And we talked about how we can make this into real GDP, which is where we fix the prices in a given year and then just let the quantities go up, in our case food and clothes, over time. So we get these different numbers here. Of course, we saw that if we turn this logic around, fix the basket of goods, and then let the prices change over time, we get a measure as to how the cost of things, right, is changing over time. And that's kind of what we talked about last time. Now, what I want to do now is, here I have a couple more years of this data. And indeed, you'll see, if you look at the problem set, you'll see a table very much like this there. What I want to do is talk about the behavior of this thing, in particular this thing over time per capita, right? And when I say over time, I mean over very long stretches of time, right? So we're talking about decades, centuries, so on and so forth. Real GDP growth, right, per person is what we'll talk about. Now, I mentioned that before class that I pared down the lecture, and I didn't want to have to do too much, and I wanted to keep the message simple and straightforward. And I think I've said in the past that, or I said last class, that this is, in some ways, the most important thing you can think about as an economist, and in some ways is the most difficult thing you can think about. But before we get into that, just to remind you what I'm talking about when I talk about growth, I'm talking about the percentage change of something over time, right? So in this case, in our case, we'll be talking about, well, real GDP per capita, per person, right? But here's a very simple example of the basic calculation, a percentage change over time. V2 is the value in the current year or year 2, however you define it. V1 is the value in V1. The percentage change is just the difference between the two divided by the initial value, right? So V2 minus V1 is the change, the year-over-year change in GDP. V1 is the value that you started with, right? The growth rate is just the change divided by the starting point. So one of the things about calculation, I deleted the slide because I didn't want to, I wanted to jump right in today. I didn't want to bore you with that. Sometimes you have to worry a little bit about V1 because it's in some sense a frame of reference and you want it to be consistent and not change how you do things. But suffice it to say for now, my little calculation here, I actually looked at the Fred website. 2023, we had a real GDP, just in general, not per capita, of 22 trillion, 607.671. And of course, it was 22.034 trillion in 2022. So the growth rate, just like that, gives us something like 2.9%, right? Year over year, you might even hear the lingo, year over year real GDP per capita growth, right? 2.9%. So we might say that the amount of stuff in general that our economy produced increased about 3% between these 2 years. It doesn't seem like a lot, right? But one big lesson that you learned today is that even very small growth rates can achieve great things over time, right? Because of the miracle of continuous compounding, right? I don't know if it's a miracle, but I'll say it that way to make it sound a little bit more interesting. Due to continuous compounding, and so this, by the way, maybe later in class when we talk about markets and all that stuff, might be my one piece of investment advice is that you just invest early and often in a market so you can take advantage of this continuous compounding, right? So what is this? Well, continuous compounding, I can maybe even show you, I'll tell you what this table means in a second. If you look at what we have here, we have an Excel spreadsheet. Maybe I'll leave it like that. We have an Excel spreadsheet where in each case, 1, 2, 3, 4, I'll talk about the cases in a second, we're investing $100, right, in whatever you're thinking about. In this case, I have a value of an interest rate. The interest rate is 1%, right? And so what we're doing is we're taking this $100, we're investing in this might be like your savings account. You put it in a savings account, the interest rate is 1%, right? So at the end of the year, you have $101, right? And so what do you do with that $101? Well, when you're continuously compounding, you take that $101, the 100 in principal, plus the $1 in interest, and you reinvest it, right? So you reinvest this $101, and then that grows by 1% over time, right? And becomes, 101 doesn't just grow doesn't grow to 102, it grows to 102 plus a little bit more because you've reinvested the interest. So you can see here my formula. What I do is, I don't know if you can, if you're good with Excel or Google Sheets formulas, you can see here the formula says B2 plus B2 times J2. Well, J2 over there is 0.01. So I've taken the value under 1, B2. I take that and I calculate the interest and I add it to it. But when I get to year 3, you'll see I'm using this value, applying interest to that and calculating this, so on and so forth. So after a while, this curve starts to create you can see here that we're getting, by the time we get down to 123.2, well, when we earn 1% interest on this, it becomes 124.5. So now you're starting to see the principal plus the interest that we've earned is starting to snowball, if you want to think about it that way. Okay, so what do we get when we look at this over time? So here's an interest rate here I have a 1% interest rate That's pretty low, right, even by savings account standards. I have 2, 3, and 4 are my other columns, right? Well, my second growth rate is 2.5%. My third growth rate is 3%, and my fourth growth rate is 10%, right? You probably wouldn't think of any of the first three as really being a big deal. The 4 here, 10%, that's a pretty good one. But what do these things look like over time? So I've graphed all 4 of these here, and what do I have here? 50 years of growth. You can see here, well, I haven't graphed the 10%, but the blue line is 1% growth, right? And the lesson you might learn here is that at 1% growth with continuous compounding, my $100 in 50 years becomes $162. The red line indicates that my $100 becomes, at the end of 50 years, $209. So it's a little bit more than doubled. But if you look at my 4% growth rate, pretty low rate, you can see here my 1%, or my 100 initial dollars, has now tripled in value, right, at 4%. So that's a pretty substantial change. Now, if you look at this, I mean, this one is ridiculous, this last one. Look what happens at a 10% interest rate. Your $100 doubles in less than 10 years, and then it doubles again in 8 years. And you can see the frequency of the doubling gets faster and faster until at the end of 50 years, your $100 has become $10,000, right, at 10% interest. So 2 lessons from this. One is that even small differences in these interest rates, even when they're small, like a 1% difference, over a long period of time can make an enormous difference. That's one lesson. The other lesson is that continuous compounding, the snowball effect, can really get rolling at just about any interest rate, right? So by the way, if you invest in a mutual fund, like say an S&P 500 mutual fund, does anybody know on average, if you look at the century, last century, say, of investing, what the average real return rate is in the market, the stock market? I don't even know off the top of my head, but the number I have in my mind is 6-7%. That's pretty good, right? I mean, you might not get $10,000 from 100 in 50 years, but you'll get pretty close at a number like that. So you might say, the lesson you might learn from continuous compounding is early and often, right, if you're going to invest. So, one other way of thinking about this, one other little tidbit by this, is if you take accounting or anything like that, or even calculus, you might see growth rate formulas where we have the number E here, right? Does anybody know what E is the base of the natural logs, right? Does anybody know about what the value is? It's like 2.7818, and it's an irrational number, so the decimal goes on forever. It's this number that derives from limiting, right? If you take the limit of continuous compounding, as you let the periods get very, very small in between the payments of interest and the putting back of the interest into the investment. So, for example, in principle, what you could do is take that $100, calculate the daily interest, add it in, and then invest that, right? Then after 2 days, so on and so forth, and you might say, well, why wait a whole day? Why not just do it by the hour? Or why not just do it every second, right? That's how you arrive at E, right? This number for continuous compounding. And if you're an accountant, you probably use that number to calculate the value of an investment off in the future. If the interest rate is R, T is the amount of time, and then you can use this to calculate this. Anyways, another little fact before I get to the middle bullet point here, that you can use when you're thinking about these things is the rule of 70, right? So this is kind of a neat rule to have in your toolkit. If you're thinking about something growing at some rate R, right? Percentage change, by the way, let me accentuate that. You're thinking about a percentage change year over year as R. In our case, we had what, 2.9% or 4, whatever was going on in my examples there. If you divide that growth rate into 70, right, that gives you a rough estimate as to how long your investment will take to double, right, in size. So in our example, we might think about GDP per capita, or GDP in my example, but suppose GDP per capita, we had a growth rate of 2.9, right? If we divide 70 by 2.9, we get 24.13. So that suggests that when our economy grows at a rate of 2.9%, the size of the economy doubles every 25 years. It's kind of shocking, right, that it doubles that quickly? But you might think about this, and people used to say this, I haven't heard it in a while for maybe some reasons we'll talk about. If you think about a generation of being about 25 years, you can think of this as the source of this idea that every generation is twice as well off as the one before it, right? The economic version of this statement would be real GDP per capita is twice as large every 25 years, right? At this growth rate of 2.9%. And so middle bullet point now, this is really the key application of this idea, right? The single most important consequence of all of this is the growth of real GDP, understanding why it happens and what it looks like. This is the most important fact, maybe of human history, with one other fact, two other facts I might add in, right, to all of this. Okay, which is why I deleted all those slides before the lecture here. So, yeah?
Where did number 70 come from? Why 70?
It's just a mathematical, it's a mathematical artifact. It's one of these things where I don't really have a great explanation as to why it's 70, but it's just, a rule of thumb. When you look at a bunch of these numbers, you say, all right, well, that seems to be about the doubling. If we divide it into 70, I'd have to think about that.
I mean, they divide it somehow, or like it should be divided.
Right, so if you take x equals e to the RT times x, right? And then maybe you can do it that way. And you sort of figure out, on average, when does that 1 become a 2? I'm kind of thinking out loud. I'll have to think about that offline a little. That's interesting. Anyways, so I have a whole bunch of links here. I'm just going to kind of walk us through here. But a lot of this data comes from this website here, which is on economic growth, right? Which you can think about as just being understanding where our year-over-year GDP comes from. Well, if you kind of look at our GDP, you can see that one of the interesting features of real GDP, at least when you look at this graph, is that it does appear to kind of follow this profile of data that goes up at a more or less constant growth rate, right? That is to say, if you look at this graph, it looks exponential, kind of like my curve here, right? Like maybe my yellow or my red one. Our real GDP per capita, put in other words, kind of seems like it goes up and up and up, according to this exponential curve, which suggests that maybe it has a roughly, a growth rate as I've described here. So, interestingly, when we talk about macroeconomics, we'll be talking about these blips, right? And those are, when you look at them up close, they seem pretty bad. That's the science of recessions, or maybe the art of recessions and all that. We'll get to that starting next class. But for now, we're just going to talk about why there's this trend here that looks more or less exponential. So let's just kind of look at this from an even longer perspective. And this is, the pattern isn't all that different if you go all the way back to 1650 in the United States, right? So it suggests that, well, and you might even say that, around 1800 when our numbers get better, it really kind of starts to take shape. That's an interesting thing. So 1650, I sometimes think of that year when I get on the Hutchinson River Parkway. Anne Hutchinson, an early resident of New York State, I guess is who it's named after, who was around at that time, or roughly. But we can even go back even further, and we see something maybe that looks a little bit exponential, or maybe not. We can talk about this. This is GDP in the United Kingdom, right? Starting in 1270, right? So that's like that's a long time ago, and you can see here that at least starting at some point here, it kind of has this exponential profile that we've been talking about, right? This starting to grow in the manner I've talked about. Maybe not so much here. And in fact, if you bring some more data to this, Well, maybe we can go back even further. People have calculated GDP from year 1, right, to year 2022. And once again, we have this, I guess you could say now it's emerging that we have a relatively flat line, and then we have this sort of exponential growth period setting in, right? So this is a big historical fact, you might say.
Is it imaginary?
Huh?
Is it imaginary for year 1?
It is. Okay, well, you might wonder how you go back and calculate GDP in year 1. I don't know, but economic historians, they pore over. It's actually a fascinating. I can say a little bit about English GDP. 1270 is hard enough, right? Let alone year 1. You pore over population records. You look at the prices of various products. You look at wages. There's actually really good wage data going way back into medieval times for England, and very good church records, right, on marriages and things like that. One of the interesting things about all of this, I call it here a Malthusian trap, more on that in a second, is that it seems like we've escaped what you might call the Malthusian trap. Now, when you think about Malthus, Thomas Malthus, and Malthusian, what typically comes to mind? Let me ask you, Malthus, I say Thomas Malthus, you think of nothing, I don't know, what, anything?
Rats.
You think of rats. Why would you think of rats?
I believe because there's like that trap when people are competing for, not rats in like the isolated territory are competing for resources.
Okay.
And everyone is ready to sacrifice something, and they're now just competing for how much you're ready to sacrifice for some kind of a good or something like this.
That's not bad. I might say it as following, right? So you might say, let's think about a typical subway stop where you have a certain population of rats. I don't know, 2 million? How many? There's actually a rat census of the United States, or of New York City, I'm sorry. This actually is a pretty good example. And you can imagine that the rats feed on the trash there, and that supports their population. What happens when you double the amount of trash in the subway? I see someone pointing up. What happens to the population of rats? It increases, right? So if you think about this from the perspective of the typical rat, in the end, things aren't any better with twice as much food as they were, right, with half as much food, because the number of rats always increases to meet the capacity, right, of the food available, right? And so this sounds a little bleak, but most of human history was kind of like this, right? And if you look down here, you can kind of see, if you look at my years here, 1450, 1500, maybe even 1600, you can see here what we have is a graph of population and GDP per capita in, in England, right? And so you can see here that for these points in time, higher population tended to be associated with lower GDP per capita, kind of the Malthus effect, right? So when there were more people, there was less stuff per people. And that seems to be true for a whole range of time periods, right? 1280 to maybe even if we pushed it up to 1650, right? Now a little bit after that time, 1650, the data goes in a completely different direction, right? Suddenly, we have this trajectory where we're breaking out of the Malthusian trap, right? Now, population and income start rising together, right? Which is a pretty crazy thing, and something that is absolutely astounding in terms of world history. So it's interesting. I have a colleague who talks about this, has written some really, really great books. And I saw him give a talk a long time ago where he basically said you can split human history into kind of two periods, right? There was the period before this, let's say, I'll call it 1750, and the period after, right? Before 1750, you might even think about it this way. You go from that point and you go backwards, a couple thousand years or so. The well-being of the typical person was about the same, right? So I might put this to you, I might say, would you rather live in medieval Europe at 1200, right? 600? Would you rather live in ancient Rome or medieval Europe? Ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, I don't know. It's all, it's pretty much the same, but around that point in time, something changed, right? And the world started going in a completely different direction, right? And of course, ever since, we've now gotten to an interesting point where we can look across the world and we see a picture of something that looks something like this. Here's GDP per capita around the world in 2022. Even now we have this tremendous variation across the world in GDP per capita. So you can see the very light colored parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa typically, and some other places, are somewhere between 0 and 1,000 US dollars per year, GDP per capita. But a lot of the world is up at this, above 50,000. So you can see that is Western Europe, the United States, Australia, places like that. So when I say we've all broken out of this Malthusian trap, that may or may not be the case. But let me just show you this, which will say something about how, I should have looked at this ahead of time, but I didn't. Let's see if we got it here. All right. Whoop.
Visualization is right at the heart of my own work too. I teach global.
So this, by the way, let me just preface this by saying this is a quick take on world growth, right, over the past almost century by Hans Rosling, who does some very nice work with interactive graphics and or has done some nice work with that stuff. So this is kind of a neat thing that'll give you an interesting perspective on all of this.
Global health. And I know having the data is not enough. I have to show it in ways people both enjoy and understand. Now, I'm going to try something I've never done before. Animating the data in real space, with a bit of technical assistance from the crew.
So, here we go. First, an axis for health, life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person, $400, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries.
1750.
Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubbles show the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only UK and the Netherlands was slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe. And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up. Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle. But there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China. I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa.
And yet, despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner.
Well, what you just seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
Okay, so the point I'm trying to make is that this was a history-changing thing that happened, right? As we moved from, the way I've put it, from that first time period to the second time period, not only are we no longer in a Malthusian world, but we're in this world where suddenly countries are, people are, population is growing at the same time, everybody's getting healthier and wealthier, right? And this isn't just the United States, right? Maybe it was up until, about 100 years ago, but around that World War II period in time, things started spilling over to the rest of the world. So now, right, there's been this enormous convergence across the world in wealth, with some countries lagging behind. You probably saw that there was some, particularly sub-Saharan Africa looks like it's lagging a little bit. It's interesting that not only have these health things sort of gone on with this period, this, I guess, new period of time, there's also been this massive demographic transition, which is a complicated thing that economists think a lot about. And that's this demographic transition, which has to do with the fact that, not only have we seen, talk about breaking out of the the Malthusian trap, not only have we done that, but now it's also the case that people tend to have a lot fewer children than they did before, right? So it's not like for want of a better analogy, the rats in the subway, right? Where every time income goes up, people multiply. It seems like even the opposite is happening, and there are a huge number of reasons for that, right? And so here we have one of the consequences of this, our birth rates around the world. You can see here the higher birth rates typically correlate with lower income countries. And the lowest birth rates here are down in this 1.0. So what is this? This is total fertility rate. Total fertility rate is the average number of children that a woman will have in her lifetime. And it has to be somewhere above 2 for the population to sustain itself, right? Because, a woman has to replace herself and one man, right, to sort of be at replacement. So you can see most of the world seems to be actually, geographically anyways, seems to be edging below replacement. So this is another consequence of this, and it's kind of anti-Malthus, right, going on. And the reasons for that are manifold, but it's a really interesting thing to think about. So what is the basic lesson here? Something changed in Western Europe. I will say even England and Holland, as Rosling pointed out there. I don't know, around 1700 to 1800. Maybe if we're being sentimental Americans, we can pin that down on 1776, right, as the big year. That was the year The Wealth of Nations was published also, right, by Adam Smith. And so at some point around that time, we broke out of this Malthusian trap with some lags, right? So, and once you sort of see this, right, and you think about world history this way, it's hard to think about it in any other way, right? What happened, right? Why did this happen? And you might even think, well, if we wanted to dig into this a little bit, what does this mean for economic growth? Well, one thing you can kind of look at here, it's kind of this interesting website here, and it has this map of GDP per capita per country, and you can see, I mean, we've kind of talked about this fact before. But what was I going to do here? I was going to look at a country. Let's see what happens if we pick out the United States here. What do we get out of this? Okay, there's the United States, our current per capita. Okay, let's see here. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm fumbling around here. It happens. Okay, so we can look at regions. Give me a second here. How did I do this? So here's a map of GDP growth, right? And you can kind of look at the trend over time. What I was hoping to show you here, it didn't quite work out the way I intended. But you can look at these countries here, and you can actually see that one of the big facts about all of this is that some of these countries have had pretty bad growth profiles over time, right? So for example, here you see Sudan had negative 20.3% growth in a recent period. And now this has tremendous consequences when you start to think about compounding over time, right? If you lose 20% of your GDP, now the point at which you're compounding going forward is 20% lower, and it ricochets throughout time. So a couple of these bad growth experiences can cause several problems here, or it can cause a low growth profile. Sorry. So another way of thinking about this too is you can kind of think about, here we have population and time. It's kind of a similar map. So right around here is that critical time we've been talking about, where not something else has happened in that we've had this, we had agriculture started, and then we had some pottery after a couple thousand years. We had the plow come along a couple thousand years after that. Innovation was kind of slow, right, and not that consequential. But recently, right, this has become the engine of what's going on here, is new inventions, new innovations, all of these things, right? And so we have to think about that as well. Look at the frequency of fundamental innovations, how it's picked up here. Electrification, that wasn't that long ago. My grandmother, I believe, did not have electricity in the house she was born in, but had television a couple years later. So this leads us to kind of this key question. Why did the Industrial Revolution happen, right? Holland and England there, which kind of kicked off everything, when it did and where it did, right? And this is a big question that you can think about as you're walking around or when you're on the subway. There's a very famous book that you might want to read about this. It's written by not an economist, but a biologist, which is kind of a good thing, because an economist would have hamstrung his or herself before they got going. It's called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And it's kind of a discussion as to why this happened in Western Europe, going way back into ancient history, right? And so he has all of these things. He says, well, why was it Europe and not, say, China or the Middle East or even the Indian subcontinent, all of these sort of super regions of the world? If you go back to the year 1400, say, they all look about the same, right? And it's not obvious that, weird little Western Europe with its violence and strange little regions was going to be the place that was going to catch fire technology and growth-wise. Yet it did. And so Diamond has all of these different reasons, these deep reasons for why this happened, right? He talks about growable seeds, right, and herdable animals that you had in Europe that were just kind of naturally there by accident that weren't elsewhere, right? Which was unlike Africa or even North and South America. He talked about how maybe just by a historical accident, Europe wound up with all these different countries that were in competition with one another, and this was something that pushed the world forward, right? So if you've ever read, there's a neat book called, I think it's called Latitude, or is it Longitude? I'm mixed up. But anyways, it documents how there was this race between countries to figure out a technology by which you could measure location accurately. right? Because it was critical for shipping and sailing and all of that stuff. And so, who could build the best clock? Because if you know exactly what time it is, you can kind of figure out exactly where you are. And I think maybe it's latitude. I'll have to look it up. So there was that. And he even talks about how, with the Eurasian continent, there's this sort of east-west axis. So things can travel pretty quickly east-west, faster than they can north-south, just because of, seasonality and all that. So the problem is, of course, is we have this one fact. Western Europe took off. And then there's a million different ways you could explain it. And that's what I mean when I say history is overdetermined. So people have suggested all sorts of reasons why some countries grow. Some point to institutions, more on that in a second. Some say accumulation, right? It's the cumulative effects of building things up over years. Some say some countries just have better natural resources or have a better overall, outlook, a liberal outlook maybe. But then you can sort of think about the caveat question, which is, we saw in our maps and all that. Why have some countries not grown? And what can be done to help them, right? And of course, this is the subject of economic development or economic growth. So we do have all these varieties of economic models, right? Accumulation models are based upon capital, right? And this is an explanation as to why some countries grow. They have more capital, maybe even what we call human capital, which is knowledge, accumulated knowledge, and all of that stuff. There's these sociological models, which describe the growth as the result of some sort of outlook or some sort of change in, entrepreneurial spirit. People have also focused on health and nutrition, right? So Robert Fogel won the Nobel Prize for thinking about this and how, people have gotten healthier as a result of many of these innovations. And as you get healthier, you have all these incentives that change. More on this in a couple of slides. It changes your whole life outlook, right? How much education you get and how you view a whole host of things. Property rights and governance has been in the news a little bit lately. And that means that good property rights matter a lot for development, right? So places with good property rights institutions grow. I'll talk about that in a second too. We have endowments in geography. How much does that matter? Having natural resources. And people have even pointed that to, it's something that was developed thousands of years ago about populations that make them more amenable to growth. So I think about this a lot. Like I for whatever reason, I did a deep dive into British history, and you can go back to the Romans leaving, and then they have this, the Anglo-Saxons coming in and fighting with the Britons, and then nothing sort of happened. Not nothing, but you have those populations, and then you have the Norman invasions, and you're like, okay, so we had this population that was more or less left alone, but repeatedly, every now and then had an invasion, right? I don't know. So it's an interesting and difficult question. Okay, so all of those explanations for economic growth, right? It's the biggest question, but it's also the most complicated. What is it about growth that really mattered? Well, or why did it happen? Well, capital-based models, this idea that accumulation is what has produced growth, right? Cumulative building up of machinery, say, over time, has some problems, right? We have this idea that it seems like the built-up countries of the world are also the most wealthy, but there are these weird things that have happened in history that suggest that maybe we're looking at correlation and not causation here, right? We really care about what's causing this. So one example, World War II, we had massive destruction of Japan and German capital stocks, right? Basically, the countries were leveled. Yet what happened next was, a couple years, and boom, they were back on this awesome growth trajectory, right? The old 3% per year, if not more. And so, 10 years after the war, they were basically caught up and maybe even pushing ahead. Well, in the 50s, people thought that this was how growth worked. And so this led to a lot of interventions in less developed countries where you would give them massive infusions of capital, right? So you'd go into a less developed country in sub-Saharan Africa, you'd build up the infrastructure, you'd invest in all of these things. That didn't seem to work, right? A lot of them didn't get much further than where they started with these massive infusions. So human capital is another one, right? People say, well, it's because people have all this knowledge and they're highly educated. Once again, the causal question is hard to disentangle. We'll talk, hopefully I have a whole lecture on causality that'll be a lot of fun later in the semester. But you have this problem in that a lot of the less developed countries of the world have a pretty high supply of very highly educated people. And that doesn't seem to be leading to growth. Well, sociological models, Max Weber wrote in 1905 the famous The Protestant Work Ethic, right? This idea that it was something about Protestantism and thriftiness and, work for its own sake and all of that, right? This idea that if you accumulated wealth in this life, it was a sign you were blessed, right? And that was one of the engines that caused economic growth and led to accumulation and all of that. Okay, and that sounds good, but there's a couple problems with this. Economists are very clever about thinking about things like this, and so there's a really neat paper, I should find it for you, where this author looks at Protestantism in Germany because, around the Middle Ages, there was, after the Reformation, there was more or less a patchwork of Protestant and Catholic places in Germany, and he says, well, was there any correlation in growth across these regions of Germany? And the answer is no, right? They look about the same. You can't really say it was, the religiosity of one place that led to growth. And of course, there's also this fact that, in heavily Catholic northern Italy, that was where the germs of the Industrial Revolution really started cooking, right? So you had, all these inventions. The Italian city-states, they invented double-entry bookkeeping for all you accountants in the crowd who learn all about that. And they also invented the number E, or discovered it and applied it. Right? So they could do continuous compounding of interest. So problems with that theory as well. Recently, people have focused on property rights and institutions, right? So the idea is that a common law regime with good property rights, right, where you sign a contract with me, you don't fulfill your end of the bargain, I can go to the courts and sue you. If you damage my property or seize it, you're not generally allowed to, but there will be severe legal consequences. That means I can capture the fruits of my own labor, and that maybe leads to economic growth, people wanting to invest and earn returns on what they do. And so we have this hypothesis that countries with very strong property rights and good institutions, well, those are the countries that grow the most quickly, right? And so our last Nobel Prize in economics, Ashemalu, I think you pronounce it, Johnson and Robinson, they figured out a way to maybe test some of this idea, right? And the test of this hypothesis was that good institutions lead to good economic growth, had to do with what Westerners did when they first encountered other populations around the world. So the argument, if you want to get around this causality and correlation thing, is you need some randomness, right? And why good institutions popped up in one place vis-a-vis another, right? We'll talk about causality later in class. What would produce such randomness? Well, they say rates of settler mortality. So if you go to country A, and it's just the case that Europeans can't live there because they get disease and die, they have a tendency to not set up good institutions, right? Good courts of law, good governance structures, all of those things. If they could, however, set up shop in an area and not die from disease, well, that would lead to better institutions. So they look at data around the world, what the early institutions looked like. So that would be, what was the institutional structure of the country in the 1800s. They have elections and courts and all that stuff, property rights. Well, that spills over to make current institutions, right? Law tends to depend upon what was in place before. And then that leads to good current performance. So people have talked about this extensively, and there's it's been a very, if you look at the paper, I have a link there. Let me see here. It's been, maybe we can get an idea as to how many times, this is the colonial origins of comparative development. So here you have settler mortality and GDP per capita today. That's kind of you could call it the reduced form of the argument. People have put, there's all sorts of things. It's a data-driven argument, and as with any test of a hypothesis, you have to kind of, parse out how good the data is. Is it really capturing what you want it to? Is it really randomizing in a meaningful sense? So there's all that. One of the interesting things about this is if we think about conditions, in the past is leading to current growth, one way of also thinking about those sorts of things is initial conditions. What sorts of natural resources do you have? Well, it turns out there's a literature out there that says not only are having good resource endowments, like things like oil and timber and all that stuff, that can actually be bad for development. And we call that Dutch disease, right? The idea being that, well, if you have all this oil that you're sitting on, what happens is people spend their resources fighting over control of the oil rather than, inventing a better mousetrap or a better rat trap, as the case may be, and pushing their wealth forward that way, right? You get stuck in these quabbles over who owns the resource. So there's kind of this neat article here that I linked if you're interested, right? And it talks about what the Dutch large resource discoveries can be harmful to economies in the long term, and that seems to be, just casual, correlation again, not necessarily causation. That's hard to know. It does seem like a lot of countries that have a lot of oil struggle in other dimensions, right? Not all of them, but some of them. What do we have next here? Well, it's also interesting to think not about endowments of things like oil, that's one resource, but you might think about endowments in a different way. You might say, well, when we talk about what a country is like and what it has to begin with, maybe we care about geography, and a lot of economists have thought about this. So here's an example of how that might work.
Think about some of the biggest and most prosperous cities you've been to. What do many of them have in common? Water. They sit on a major coast or on a major river. This map shows GDP density, how much GDP is produced per square kilometer. You can see that the coast of the US and the areas along the navigable rivers of the Great Lakes regions are just chock full of GDP. Likewise in Western Europe, in Japan, along the coast of China, and the coast of Australia. Why is this? It's much cheaper to transport goods over water than over land. So, Adam Smith argued that access to water reduced the cost of trade and gave merchants access to larger markets. In turn, larger markets gave merchants a greater incentive to specialize and to innovate. As a result, civilization grew where trade was easiest. Even today, countries that are landlocked are on average poorer than countries that have access to a coast. What's the most landlocked continent of all? It also happens to be the continent with the most poor countries, Africa. First off, Africa is enormous. You can fit most of the United States, China, India, and a lot of Europe into Africa. That's big. Second, Africa is landlocked. While Africa is far bigger in total size than Europe, if you just measure the coastline, Europe has 2 to 3 times more coastline than does Africa. And because Africa is big and landlocked, trade is more expensive and economic growth slower to start. What we learned from this foray into civilization and geography is 2 things. First, being landlocked is like a natural tariff, a natural tax on trade. And if natural tariffs are bad for growth, then perhaps tariffs created by governments aren't that great for growth either. Second, growth is not just about policy. Some places have natural blessings that have helped those places to prosper, and that too helps us understand our world. If you want to test yourself, click practice.
Now, I don't know. It's tough to say because once again, you sort of have one fact, right? And the one fact that little video had was, well, there's a lot of poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and it also seems to be landlocked. I don't know. Can you make a formal statistical test out of that? Economists have tried, and hopefully you, after today's lecture, you start thinking maybe you're the one who will come up with the test of that fact. But anyway, so the fact remains that the world has changed over these last couple hundred years, and it's pretty important that I think you kind of understand how well this has worked. One thing people make a big deal about is that some people are enormously rich today, right? I tend to not worry about that so much, and maybe other we can differ. There can be differences of opinion there, but you might be thinking about people like these billionaires here. These are I guess the wealthiest people in the world right now. So it's the usual. There's Elon Musk. You can see how much he's worth. His net worth has gone up a bit in the past couple of days. Same age as me, by the way. So there you have it, right? It's interesting. It seems like the wealthiest person in the world, their wealth today is comparable to past billionaires, right? So for example, John D. Rockefeller, I'll show you his wealth in a second. I'm going to go to a slideshow here for a reason. Actually set a record. He owned, it's calculated, 1.5% of U.S. GDP at one particular point in time. One person. So his national income, well, about almost 2% of it was his, right? And so you can it's interesting to kind of look at the richest people in the world going back a couple of years. So I think most of you probably know John Jacob Astor and the Astor family, right? A big name in New York, as are the Vanderbilts, right? The Carnegies and Rockefellers, even the Ford Foundation, all that. We have Bill Gates, many of the usual suspects. You can see what would happen if you took their net worth at its peak and made it into current U.S. dollars, or adjusted it, right? You can see I go up to 2010s here. Vanderbilt, or Rockefeller at his height was $550 billion, so he would have been wealthier than Elon Musk by today's standards. So a question, let me ask you a question. Would you trade places with any of these people? By that I mean, you could be John Jacob Astor, right, with hundreds of billions of dollars of wealth, right? The only catch would be, well, you get all their fabulous wealth, the only catch is you have to live in the era they lived in. So I give you 148 billion of today's dollars, right, whatever it was, or I deflate it so it's whatever it was in 1840, and then I give it to you and I say, there you are. Live your life here in 1840s New York. How many people would take that trade? Okay, a couple people. Not many though. I wonder why. Let me maybe I'll push that a little further. How many people would trade places with Henry Ford in the 1940s? How about Bill Gates in the 1990s? Okay, we have some takers, but not everybody, right? What's the problem? Why wouldn't you want to be Bill Gates living in 1990? Well, things have changed pretty dramatically since then. And one thing is the sort of stuff that was available for you to buy back in those days, right, was a little bit different. So if you trade places with Astor, not only, you don't have, forget about your phone, you can forget about electricity, you can forget about getting Thai food, you can forget about, taking an airplane flight anywhere. None of that stuff was around, and a lot of you, as soon as I said phone, my kids would be like, I'm out. They wouldn't want to live even when I was a kid. So the amount of the things that we have are drastically different. And so even if you go to the bottom of my list here, health, disease, and infection, back in those days, right, you could scratch your finger and die from it, right? There were no antibiotics and stuff like that. Syphilis, good God, heaven forbid that you got that or were born with it, right? That was more or less a fatal disease, right? Up until actually fairly recently. There's polio epidemics. I just finished reading this neat book on the polio epidemic. It's called The Moth and the Iron Lung. It's kind of an interesting public health story there for you to think about. But I'm just thinking about, if we start talking about the stuff that I remember, we can, here we have in 1950s, there was a transistor radio that everybody had. That was a big invention. We actually have one of those up in our department, and students routinely ask me, what is that? Right? It's a radio with a little knob on it and all that stuff. Well, we had, of course, Polaroid cameras. This was my first computer, was the famous Commodore VIC-20, right? You can see what it looked like. What did the 20 stand for? It had 20K. 20K of RAM. Can you imagine that? So this is kind of what it looked like.
Great. The new GoDaddy Arrow has AI marketing tools to help smooth.
Why buy just a video game from a tower and television? Invest in a wonder computer of the 1980s for under $300. A Commodore VIC-20. Unlike games, it has a real computer keyboard. With the Commodore VIC-20, the whole family can learn computing at home. Plays great games, too. Under $300, the wonder computer of the 1980s, the Commodore VIC-20. Coming soon, the Commodore brings you Gorf, the Wonder arcade game, and Omega Racing home version. Commodore.
I wonder where these other videos come from. So things have changed pretty dramatically. 20K is not a lot of random access memory when you have, what, 16 gigabytes on your typical computer nowadays. So this slow and steady economic growth that set in and has had all these these profound consequences for society. I guess the natural question that people always ask is, well, will it go on forever? And it's interesting to me that people have always sort of wondered, everybody always says, well, growth is ending. It's coming to an end one of these days, and that day is soon. And you don't have to look any further than maybe the movies that you watch or that have watched over the years, for example. And so people are still thinking about the world in Malthusian terms, right? That will exhaust all the resources of the world, that it will somehow be overpopulated. So I have all these movies here. How am I doing on time? Maybe I can just show you The Thinning here, because it's kind of a fun. This was a Malthusian movie. I'm guessing most of you haven't seen it, but here's the trailer. You might recognize a couple of these people in the. Let's see.
How many sides does a pentagon have?
5.
What causes disease?
Bacteria.
How many letters are in the alphabet?
26.
Take your time. Focus on the equation. You're going to do great.
I love you.
I love you so much. What if only the smartest boys and girls got to live here?
We are the #1 most educated population in 196 countries.
You'll have 2 hours to complete the test. All grades are final. Here are the results. No.
No, Michaels. What?
Ellie Harper.
Here's Logan Paul coming in.
I'm sorry, son. My hands are tied.
So you see all the drama surrounding The Thinning. So these sorts of things have been going on for a long time. Soylent Green was another movie in this tradition. It's kind of a fun. I don't want to spoil the plot for you, but that goes way back to 1972. One of my favorites here. Well, I don't have it here, but it's interesting. We talked about global fertility rates; they're falling. And in fact, there's actually one movie in this bunch. It's one of my favorite. I'm a big science fiction fan. Children of Men is about a time when there's no children, right? It's kind of an interesting movie there. So people are always worried about that, right? Depleting all the resources of the world. People are also worried about, some sort of collapse, a natural disaster triggering the world. Well, it's interesting that, these things have been around for a long, long period of time, and this is still an ongoing debate between Paul Ehrlich, I believe, who wrote this book called The Population Bomb in the 1960s, and it was about how the world was overpopulated. And so we have all these movies that I've collected over the time. I've seen them all. Mad Max, right? Maybe some of you have seen the original Mad Max, or at least the most recent iteration, Fury Road. What is it? With Charlize Theron and Thomas Hardy. You've maybe seen those sorts of movies. Of course, there's all the zombie movies about how everything is going to fall apart. I actually talk a lot about those in my history of economics classes. We're sometimes worried about runaway consumerism, which is the opposite of the thinning, right, with Logan Paul. It's we worry about how we're distracted by something that consumerism pulls us away from our real world problems. We get dumber and dumber. So you get like Death Race. I don't know if you've seen that one. That one's been remade many times over the years. Idiocracy. Has anybody seen Idiocracy? That's a great movie. It's about how a guy gets frozen in time and wakes up 1,000 years later and discovers he's I think it's Luke Wilson is the star of that. He wakes up 1,000 years later and he's far and away the smartest person in the world. I'll let you look at the trailer there. And people have always worried about something, right? When the car was invented, people worried that it was too fast for people's, for their human brains, you know, so a car going 20 miles an hour, people just couldn't process information fast enough. This little article is an interesting one. Novels are bad for everyone, right? There was a time where people thought that novels were rotting the brains of people, right? You can look at the article. That's a problem I would love to have as a parent. The kids have basically given up on reading, I think. And there are these whole things about runaway classes and inequality. The rich are getting too rich. And so it's interesting. I actually just happened to catch this on like cable at one point. Metropolis was one of the first movies ever made, and it's kind of about this stuff, right? About inequality and this point in the future where we basically have these really rich people who essentially live completely apart from everybody else. So that's a little bit like Alita. I kind of liked that movie too. People are even worried about robots, right? And AI now, I guess, replacing people. This has always been a concern. It's been around us since the very first machinery was invented. So Ned Ludd was, I believe, I have a little blurb on Ned. He broke some stocking frames in 1779 because he felt that the machinery was displacing him. He might not have been wrong about that. Of course, in the United States, we have our own legend about this. I don't know if people still know about John Henry, who was a guy who worked on the railroad, building railroads, and had a notorious showdown with a rail driving, or I guess a spike driving machine. So that's kind of our version of being nostalgic about these jobs. It's interesting too. I think about this a lot. Maybe like a lot of us here. Here we have agriculture around the world, and you can look at here's GDP per capita, but we also have this map here. I'm trying to find it here. I should have found it ahead of time. I was trying to find number of people employed in agriculture. If you look at the fraction of people working in agriculture, one of the stylized facts here seems to be that in the most developed parts of the world, not the number, I should have the fraction, that's even better. Where did the share of people in agriculture go here? Anyways, if you look at it, you'll see that the countries where the fewest people work in agriculture tend to be the richest. And I say this to remind you that if you go back 100 years, right, almost, something like half of the population were farmers, right? Maybe if you think back in your own family tree, you'll get to a point where you'll find that everybody was a farmer, right? That's true of my family, well, not everybody, but it's true of a lot of my family tree. And why did they leave the farm? Well, it's difficult, backbreaking work that doesn't pay very well, right? So my grandfather actually left the farm and became an engineer. So there are these giant transitions, and today you think about that. You think about finding all, that whole segment of the population. Where did they go? Well, into jobs, service jobs, manufacturing jobs, and all of that stuff. So one thing that's interesting is that we've often sort of made this argument that technology is replacing humans, and so Brad DeLong, a popular or a noteworthy macroeconomist, calls this the sequel of the return of Rise of the Robots again, right? This idea that this time it's different. So maybe it will be, but I don't know. So far, we've been on this growth trajectory that just keeps going up and up and up. Now, one thing I will also note is that, a lot of these, we sort of make these predictions about the long run and what the economy will look like 10 years or 20 years or 30 years from now. It's really, really, really difficult, right, to make predictions about the future. If you could do so, you would be enormously rich, but most people aren't that good at it. But what we're going to do, I think, next time in our, we're going to talk a little bit about calculation of growth rates. We'll talk a little bit more about one of the big engines of all of this, that's entrepreneurship. and we'll talk a little bit about some of the role of consumerism, for want of a better word, in the United States, as we segue into talking more about macroeconomics and modeling and policy. Right, so you do have a new problem set and you have some readings. I will leave you to it and see you next time.